Okay, so here we are. We're going to simplify some trig expressions, and this is where I start to have a lot of fun with the math because, quite honestly, it's kind of fun. But what we're going to do is we're going to look to substitute and simplify. Look to substitute, you know what, substitute, factor, simplify. So those are kind of the things that we're looking to do. Sometimes we're going to have to be creative with fractions, and I'll show you those examples of why having an understanding of fractions is so important. Here we have two terms, the sine of x, cosine squared of x minus sine of x. So in Algebra 1 we talk about being able to count the number of terms you have. And then the importance of understanding when you factor, you're reducing the number of terms because you're creating a product of factors. And that's what I'm going to do here. I have two terms. I'm going to factor out what's in common of both of the terms. So for those of you that are struggling a little bit with seeing this, here's one term, here's a second term. Those terms have the sine of x in common. They're both sine and they both have the same angle. So the sine of x is in common to both of them. So I'm going to factor that out. When I factor that out, that leaves me cosine squared of x minus 1. Now, cosine squared of x, and this might be a flashcard that you make, you know, in addition to some of the other Pythagorean identities. Cosine squared of x minus 1 is related to a Pythagorean identity. So the Pythagorean identity that it's related to is sine squared of x plus cosine squared of x equals 1. Now if I subtract cosine squared of x from both sides, you can see that the sine squared of x is equal to 1 minus cosine squared of x. Well, that's fantastic here because now in place of 1 cosine squared of x minus 1, I can maybe manipulate this a little bit. But you can see here that, wait a second, the signs are wrong. So cosine squared is supposed to be positive, 1 is supposed to be negative. See, this doesn't quite substitute in directly because cosine squared here is positive, but here it's negative, and the 1 is negative, yet here it's positive. So a little bit of manipulation here. If I have sine squared of x plus cosine squared of x equals 1, and I need cosine squared minus 1, that means I would need to subtract sine squared from both sides, right? That's going to give me cosine squared of x equals 1 minus sine squared, and then subtract 1, and then I have cosine squared of x minus 1 equals negative sine squared. The other thing I could have done was I could have just multiplied both by a negative, and I would have had negative sine squared of x equals the opposite of 1 minus cosine squared. But this works right here, you know? I mean, cosine squared of x minus 1, in its place, we substitute in negative sine squared of x. So we've got sine of x times negative sine squared of x is negative sine cubed of x. Now the moral of this story and all of this work that I just did off to the side is really, really important for you to be able to do either off to the side or hopefully you'll start to kind of manipulate those Pythagorean identities in your head. Another tool that I use is I'll say sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1, so I'm not doing all of the writing. And then I say, oh, cosine squared minus 1, subtract 1 from both sides, subtract sine squared from both sides, and cosine squared minus 1 equals negative sine squared of 1. Sine squared of 1. So that's how I do show like just scratch work off to the side. So I'm going to erase this scratch work if that's okay with you. You know, you could always rewind the video and get it back if you need to. And look at what I did there. I deleted the number 2. Don't want to do that. Okay, so we're on to the next problem. Next one we have one term, cotangent of x times sine of x. Well, how could this possibly be simplified if it's already one term? Well, that's where using your flashcards, really comes in handy because we know after using our flashcards that cotangent of x is just the same thing as cosine of x over sine of x. So I'm going to use a highlighter here, again, just to bring that to your attention. Cotangent of x is the same thing as cosine of x over sine of x. And then when we multiply cosine of x over sine of x times sine of x, the sines of x cancel out, and this simplifies to be just the cosine of x. It's pretty cool. Okay, so think about this next problem. So if that requires you to press pause, that's what you're going to do. When you start feeling comfortable, press pause and see if you can try a problem. This one would not be a bad one for you to try because it takes a little bit of number one and a little bit of number two, puts them together. If you're just not comfortable with that yet, I'm going to do this problem for you. So 1 minus cosine squared is another way of saying sine squared. So 1 minus cosine squared of x is just another way of saying sine squared of x. And then cosecant of x is just another way, look at how I'm making that highlight because I know it's a fraction. It's just another way of saying 1 over sine of x. Again, if you're not sure why 1 minus cosine squared of x is sine squared of x, you're going to go off to the side and you're going to say sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1, and you're going to manipulate that Pythagorean identity so that you're solving for 1 minus cosine squared of x, and you'll see that that's sine squared. Now I have two signs on top, so sine squared of x means sine of x times sine of x. And then I'm multiplying that by 1 over sine of x. And we know that when we multiply fractions, we can cross reduce is what some call it, cross cancel. When I was growing up, it was called cross cancel, but I kind of like cross reduce a little bit better. And it cross reduces to give us a final answer of sine of x. Now number 4 is a great example of having to use our cofunction identities. So our cofunction identities, and that's where using these flashcards, these problems start going so quickly because you're using your flashcards and you already see what you're supposed to do. Sine of pi over 2 minus x is the same thing as the cosine of x. And the cosine of pi over 2 minus x is the same as the sine of x. So I'm going to use my highlighter to show that. The yellow simplifies to be the yellow, and the green simplifies to be the green. And we know, again, using our flashcards, that cosine over sine, you got it, is cotangent of x. Now, here's 2 more problems. I really encourage you to press pause and to try these, and when you're ready to press play again, I'm going to just basically do them. So when you press play again, you'll just see me doing the problems. So I have cosine squared of x, secant squared of x minus 1 is I tan by the c. I tan by the c. So 1 plus tangent squared equals secant squared. If I subtract 1 from both sides, then secant squared minus 1 is tangent squared. And then tangent squared is sine squared over cosine squared. And the cosine squareds cancel out, so our final answer is just sine squared of x. Now, from here on out, I'm going to start numbering my steps, and I encourage you to do the same because I'm going to be looking for that on your homework. Cotangent of x is the same thing as cosine of x over sine of x. And secant of x, we'll bring back Christmas here. Secant of x is the same thing as 1 over cosine of x. Cosine cancels out with cosine. Step 2, I have 1 over sine of x. And our final step, which would be our answer, 1 over sine of x, is cosecant of x.